So while we're waiting for others to get on, those of you that are here, tell me in particular, in regard to this topic, what is of concern to you? What would you like? I mean, I have a plan, but I want to also always make sure I don't leave out anything that's concerning you. So, what around your commissions are you having questions, concerns with?
One of the concerns I have, I think it's just the only concern because it was first, the first PSRA that I had signed with the buyer. So it was like, oh my God, what do I do? So I think oh yeah, I did put 2.5%. And I think I didn't explain it very well because um, the buyer wanted to make an offer on a home and they're offering 2%. So I let them know, they're offering 2%. So you only have to pay the 0.5%. And they said, oh, we don't want to pay the 0.5%. So then I said, well, you can do it out of this or do it out of that. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. So then I changed it to 2%. And then I resent it to them and signed it. Um, I feel a little better now explaining it, but I think that was the first one. I still have this buyer because their offer didn't get accepted. So I still have this buyer. So I think just with this one, if there's something that's 2%, then, I'm just going to do the 2%, even though even though I have them sign the 2.5%. And if it turns out they're only doing the 2, then I'm just going to do the 2. If they do 2.5, then that's great too. If the seller offers.
Okay, so in that particular scenario, so hold on, let me make a note. And Christina, you're not going to forget. I saw your hand go up. So if anybody has a question around this and you think you're going to forget, please put it in the chat because I do want to address this. Okay. And we'll talk about some strategies for conversations in a little bit, but just real quick to address that, Rosie. First of all, if you agree to lower it because a buyer can't, won't, whatever, although we need to work on our conversations before we just immediately reduce, which I know you said you're doing. If you do that, do a modification that reduces it to 2% for that property only. Don't just reduce it to 2% because now you're at 2% no matter what. Even if a seller offers 2.5, you can't get 2.5 because your PSRA currently says 2. So the only way to change that now is to modify it again, putting it back to the original 2.5. Now here's a caution. It doesn't look good to modify up. Now, if you don't have an offer in play, you're probably okay to do it now. But modifying down is one thing, modifying
Very good. Thank you.
I apologize.
oh, it's okay. I didn't figure out where that was coming from.
Yeah,
Modifying up, particularly when an offer's out and they come back and say they'll pay more, that we don't want to do because that doesn't look good at all. Okay. So I'm going to recommend you do another modification to get it back up to 2.5%. Explain why you're doing that. And in the future, and this is for everybody, whether it's the BRBC or the PSRA, make sure that you're modifying it for that address only. Okay, not the entire fee for anything. But now the PSR, well, hang on. You said PSRA, so was it
Right.
only for that address?
Only for that address, yes. The
Okay.
other addresses that I've been showing him, I've had it at 2.5%. And
Okay.
they sign it, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So just with a PSRA, it's probably not as big a deal unless you have more than one address on it. Okay, then you're going to want to modify it for just the address. But the BRBC, make sure you're modifying for an address only should you choose to lower your commission. Keep in mind though, people are concerned about buyers paying your fees. And remember, they always paid the fees one way or another. It was a higher price for the house. However, it got paid one way or the other by the buyer. there are all kinds of fees and closing costs in a transaction, right? There's the lender fees, there's the title fees, there's the escrow fees, there's the inspection fees. Is anybody asking them to lower their fees? Right? And so this is what we have to put in front of our buyers. There are fees to buy a home. And I'm going to do the best that I can to get you the best price. And the only way I can do that is to be paid fairly, just like everyone else that's a party to the transaction. Right? So we have to work on those conversations. We'll talk more about the conversations in a bit. Christina, you had your hand up when I asked for specifics.
Yeah, so mine's like a little similar to Rosie's, a little different though. So the county I do is Riverside County, and before all of this, it's always been 2%. Um, with that being said, I would say like a month before all the changes, a lot of agents were offering 2.25% to 2.5% to get their property sold before all these, and my guess, before all these changes. So my question is I want to get paid 2.5%. I do. I'm tired of getting paid 2%. But I just don't know because the norm in that county is 2%, if that's like gonna look bad on paper. And a two-part question. If I submit a SPBB for 2.5%, I don't want the offer to not get accepted because of my commission, me asking for 2.5% from the seller. Where if it's like, even if it's a good offer and they counter it, or they don't want to counter it at all because they have multiple other offers. So those are my concerns.
Okay. So one of the things that popped in my head when you were talking about this, and this would be good for conversation for what you also brought up, Rosie. So rather than be so quick for us to just lower from 2.5 to 2, one of the things I'm seeing, for some reason, we seem to have it in our heads, and I include myself in this, that we have to go from 3 to 2.5 to 2, right? And there's no like anything else in between. So maybe in a scenario where you had 2.5% on the PSRA and they didn't want to pay the additional 0.5%, part of the conversation could be, I'll tell you what, I'll meet you in the middle. I'll do it for 2.25%. The seller's already agreed to pay the 2, so all you'll have to come out of pocket is 0.25%. Does that sound fair? Right? So you're still getting more. You're still valuing yourself. You're still working with them, right?
And that's the conversations I do plan on having, but my concern with that is, like I said, it's always been the 2 years I've been an agent, that area has always been 2%. It's very rare that they gave more than 2%. So I don't want a buy, and a lot of the buyers they're buying their second house, so they're familiar with the process. So I'm just afraid that they're gonna be like, either A, not gonna want to use me, or B, be like, well, it's always been 2%. Like, why would I all of a sudden, because there's changes, now you want to get paid more? And I don't want it to come off as like being greedy or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, in this scenario, Christina, you said in that area it's typically been 2% to a buyer. What does the list agent had they typically been being paid prior to the changes?
I believe it's been 4% total, so 2 and 2.
Wow, that's really low. That's like,
Yeah.
I'm shocked by that, because even in areas where 3% hadn't been seen often, 2.5 was typically the
Yeah.
lowest we would see, except for an oddball thing. So the thing is we have to get good at Cisco does not like that, by the way. He says 2.5% is too low. Can you hear him? So we have to get really good at having the conversations, because remember, it isn't just the seller who's going to pay this. You can have the conversation that you expect the buyer to pay it. Okay, so it's going to depend. Each way you have the conversation is going to be a case by case. Now, part of what we're probably going to want to add to our qualifying conversations in regard to buyers, we already asked them about down payment, right? So do you have money for closing costs? We may even start bringing up the settlement changes at our qualifying conversation to set the stage, right? So find out their situation. That way, when it comes to the buyer consultation, we kind of know what we're up against and the possible objections that we may have, right? So, here's the thing, Mr. Buyer, my fee is 2.5% to be able to do all of these things that I promised you I'm going to do. Does that sound fair to you? Right? Getting their buy-in the entire time. I was just in a webinar with Phil Jones. Does everybody know who Phil M. Jones is? He's amazing. Okay. If you haven't had the opportunity to hear him, he actually wrote the book, Exactly What to Say, and he has a version for real estate agents. Okay. He was a speaker at couple family reunions ago, and he has since really been working with Keller Williams and agents about exactly what to say. And one of the things that he made a good point of today was we have to stop showing up and throwing up. Does everybody know what he means by that?
Shut up and listen.
What happens is we go into our appointments and we just start throwing up all over them. Everything we know, everything we can do, our value proposition. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Blah, 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 blah. And we're not asking enough questions. We're not finding out enough. And that's why it's so important that we have the qualifying conversation before the appointments, right? And even, I love that, Marisol. And even when we get to the appointment, we can't just show up and throw up. We've got to ask more questions. One of the things he talked about for a listing appointment is, how long have you lived here? What made you move here to begin with? How have things changed since you moved here? Right? Not going into all of the what I can do for you type things. All the 500 ways we're going to market it on the internet because we just, the MLS pushes the button and it goes out to different places. We got to find out what our clients need. And this is the same with our buyers. So protecting our commission isn't just on the buyer side, it's also on the list side, right? So we need to build that rapport with our clients. And if somebody's saying, okay, well, if the seller's willing to pay 2, I don't want to pay that other 0.5%. Okay. Can I ask what? Is there a reason that you don't want to pay that other 0.5%? Right? Instead of just going into, oh, no problem, let me do a modification, right? Let's ask some questions. Let's dig a little deeper. Right? Because maybe what are
So she had the contract signed at 2.5 to begin with, and they signed it. So that's well, can you tell me a little bit more why and what changed? Because we said 2.5 just because they're offering 2, they're helping you out. But what changed?
Well, but that also depends. And in Rosie's case, did you set it up as we'll negotiate with the seller to pay this? You won't have to worry about paying this. Or do we set it up as in, now I'm going to do my best to negotiate for the seller to pay this or at least part of it
Mhm.
so that you'll only have to pay a small amount. Does that sound fair? Right? And as we go, does that sound fair? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
All
That's
along
what I
the
meant.
way.
Like, so they said yes to it to begin with. Now
Right.
you're backwards, and that's another thing as far as going. I was going to add, once you get into the transaction, and then like right now I'm in the thing, and they're going through costs and all this other stuff. Now they're starting to look back. Well, maybe we'll just discount the agent's fee to help me out to get into this thing. It's like, well, wait a minute. You know, and so there's a lot of different circumstances now with these compensations that the sellers and buyers are thinking, well, I can't, if I don't get the transaction, you don't get paid. So let's discount out years, you know? So there's a lot of things going on.
Yeah, I think it's just good to have the right conversation, like Jody said, because
Mhm.
that was my first conversation regarding the new regarding using the new the new forms, and I was using the PSRA, and I think that I probably didn't explain it very well. That's the first one, but any others, I feel better now because I can explain that I'm negotiating for them. I'm negotiating for them for the seller to pay for it. I think my conversations are better now, but that was my first one. So I think that they probably didn't understand, maybe they didn't understand that. I think I didn't explain it very well. So I think they didn't understand that they're paying 2.5%, even though they signed a contract.
And this is new to everybody, the way we're doing this, and that's okay. But here's the thing. This is why we practice our conversations. Because the more we practice them, the better we get. And then the more confident we are at doing this. And let me ask who here has had, show of hands, who here has had a compensation conversation with a client? Okay. Did you, okay, wait, let me rephrase that. Who here has had a compensation conversation with a client since the changes have been put in place? Okay. Did your conversations all start out using the BCA, the Buyer Compensation Advisory? Okay. I am going to make a recommendation. And I'll in a few minutes, I'll pull it up on screen and we'll run through this. If you've watched the listing appointment and the buyer consultation that we have in the toolkit, you will have seen this already. You can review that as many times as you need to. And we do also have some things that we have videoed for objections that we will be making available as well. They're in the editing process. It's almost done, guys. I know I keep saying that, but it's almost done. Using the buyer compensation advisory before going into the compensation conversation is incredibly important. I might have mentioned, I don't know if I've mentioned it to you guys, the coaching team and I, we practice these conversations many different ways, and many of them felt disjointed. I watched some things with some top list agents and how they recommended doing it. And when I went to do it and practice it, it didn't feel right. It wasn't I didn't like it. So after lots of practice, what we landed on was starting with the buyer compensation advisory. Then what I find really interesting is I last week was at the CAR Expo. And I intentionally, I have an answer for you guys on something too. I intentionally went to a breakout that was specific to the changes with everything that's happening. And they recommended that we use the BCA to initiate our conversation, which made me happy to hear since that's where we had landed and where all the conversations were feeling comfortable. So not only did the coaching team do this with trial and error and practice as this was coming up and land on that, the brokers and people at CAR are recommending we start with that because it clarifies it and it just makes it easy. And when we go into a conversation where the final thing is, whether it's a listing appointment, and we say, okay, it's all we have to do for me to go to work for you is to have you sign this listing agreement. We don't just go into signing it anymore. And the same thing with a buyer consultation. Okay, all we have to do now for me to go to work for you is have you sign the buyer representation agreement. We don't just turn it around and have them sign it. After that statement, we have one more piece of work to do. Now but before I have you sign this, I want to explain how our compensation works. You might have heard some things in the news about an NAR settlement that's changed how we do things. Yes or no, right? Some have, some haven't. Most have, many haven't, right? Well, I want to explain how this works first, and then we'll have you sign this. Does that sound good? Then you pull up the buyer compensation advisory. Let me pull that up right now. Okay, Emily, before we have you sign this agreement, I do want to explain how compensation works, okay? So you'll notice here, this is our broker compensation advisory. You might have heard some things in the news about an NAR settlement changing the way we do things. Have you heard anything about that? Yeah, okay. So let me read you this last paragraph right here because this has to do with exactly that. Historically in California, many sellers brokers used a multiple listing service to make a unilateral offer to compensate a buyer's broker who procured a buyer for the seller's property. Okay, in other words, it used to be that the sellers would pay the entire commission and then they would put how much would be paid to the buyer side, and that would be listed in the MLS. Okay, we're no longer allowed to do that. Each party has to pay their own commission. You'll notice here, however, the nationwide NAR settlement prohibits the seller's broker from using an MLS to make such an offer of compensation. Okay, the California Association of Realtors listing agreement forms no longer provide for such offerings of cooperating broker compensation, nor does CAR include other forms in its library of forms that might facilitate such offers. So notice here, buyers and sellers must separately negotiate compensation with their respective brokers. Okay, so for that reason, buyers now agree to pay their agents using this buyer representation agreement. However, if you don't have the funds for that or you're running tight, it's okay. We can negotiate with the seller. The seller can still pay it, but it's now a negotiation, as you'll notice these bullet points up here. Buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker, and buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with the seller. So Emily, don't worry, we can negotiate with the seller to pay the fee or at least part of it to help out. Does that sound fair? Does that sound good? Okay, so now let's go ahead and go through the agreement. Oops, sorry. Let me get back up there. There we go. Okay, so then we're going to go through the agreement, right? We're going to say it starts today. It's for 3 months. By the way, I have an update on this. I'll tell you about that in a minute. It's for 3 months. And notice here, I've checked the box exclusive. Because Emily, for me to do everything we've talked about and find you the best house at the best price, like we've talked about, I'm going to need your assurance that you're working only with me. Does that sound fair? Okay. So my fee, I'm skipping all this other stuff, right? You don't in yours, but for purposes of today. So my fee in order to do this is 2.5%, 3%, right? What this says right here is if within 30 days of this agreement ending, should it end before we find you something, and you choose to purchase a home that we have seen together, that this compensation will still be owed to me, or that I will still represent you in that particular property. Okay? Any questions? And then you go through it again. When you get down here, they have to initial for the exclusivity again, reiterating that, and then reiterating your compensation here. Okay. Remember, all along the way, you're going to be saying, does that sound fair? Do you have any questions? Because before you get to having them sign, you want to make sure all of that has been ironed out. But when you use the buyer compensation advisory form to show them how this works, then it shows them in black and white exactly what's happening. You're getting their buy-in throughout the entirety of your conversation. So by the time you're ready for them to sign, they should happily sign it. Now, does it mean you won't get an objection or something? Not necessarily. One that I do want to bring up, because I'm told this has been a question from some of you. So let me ask, have anybody on this call, have you had the situation where the buyers are going, maybe bypassing you altogether as a buyer's agent and saying they want to go to the list agent?
Yep.
Okay. Here's the thing when it comes to that. So, Ernie, I can understand why you might want to do that, but let me explain something before you make a final decision on that, okay? So, first of all, agents can't work for free, right? It's just, I mean, you wouldn't work for free, would you? So, here's the thing. If you go directly to the list agent, one of two things is going to happen. So, either they are not going to represent you, and they have already negotiated with the seller an amount that they'll pay to be able to do the extra work because of you not having representation. But here's the thing, that agent, their fiduciary responsibility is to their seller. They will not be able to advise you. They will not be able to help you in any way other than to let you in the house, facilitate an inspector getting in. They won't be able to answer any of your questions or help you out. Now, if they are going to help you out, they're also going to need you to sign a BRBC where you're going to be paying them the same thing I'm asking you to pay. So would you rather go to the list agent where you will not be being helped properly, or work with somebody who is going to be the fiduciary for you, who's going to put your needs ahead of theirs, who's going to make sure that you are properly taken care of and represented? Do you have any questions about that? So that's how you would handle somebody saying they want to go to the list agent. Because even if they're not represented, the list agent's got something in their listing agreement. They're still going to pay a higher price for the house to compensate for that, right? So we need to explain to them that if that's the case, they're not going to be represented. Or they're going to sign a buyer's rep with that list agent, in which case, why wouldn't they sign with you? Where your obligation is to them and not the seller. Any questions about that? This is like literally, I'm asking you, I'm not role playing that.
I'd use that lawyer analogy too. So if you were gonna go to court, would you have the same lawyer argue your case, or like the, arbitration maybe, but you still got somebody that needs to represent you equally,
Yeah.
so.
So can you see how using the BCA, the buyer compensation, advisory, makes that conversation so much simpler? Because you're really reading what the form says. And literally, guys, that paragraph, that last paragraph, read it to them. Don't paraphrase, read it, and you can paraphrase it after the fact, like put it in layman's terms, like this is what we used to do. This used to be in the MLS, right? So that they understand what it means. But don't not read that paragraph.
I feel like a big part of it is a lot of us are new agents, and it's a confidence issue, because if you have full confidence in your value and what you're bringing to the table, I mean, the buyer wants to buy, the seller wants to sell. And so if you believe in yourself and you're that added piece of information and you believe that, you're not going to have a problem saying, this is my fee. And this, you just read them the forms. This is how it goes. And I also think that with the new changes, that it's been more of a big conversation in-house opposed to the general public. Like they're just hearing things on TV they don't know. And like we should be able to go forward with complete confidence that you are helping the people just like you always have. So anyway, my 2 cents.
Absolutely. Did you just hear that last thing you said at the NAR or at the CAR conference? Because I heard that too. But
Yes.
I'm glad you said that because that makes a really good point. The general public, yes, they've heard something about it. Yeah, it was on the news, but it's not in the news anymore, right? It's only in our internews. We're still talking about it every day. So we think it's this big, hairy deal. The buyers and sellers have already forgotten about it.
Mhm.
It's not being talked about anymore. It's not an issue anymore. It's just business as usual.
Well, and that's just it, they don't, like you said, they don't know. So they just automatically, and especially the way you present it, they think it's business as usual. It's like, okay, well, this is policy and this is the industry standards. And if you just present it, this is how we do it and this is what you need to do. They don't, a lot of times they don't ask questions about it,
Yeah.
But so I said, do you know how I get paid? That's how I started my deal. And then that's good to read that and just kind of explain it. And it can be negotiated on both sides. This is my standard percentage. This is what I charge. If we get to the point to where it needs to be adjusted to benefit both of us, then we will. But right now, this is the way it is. You stand, agree. And I mean, even the open houses, you still got a few people, I don't need to sign that. And I said, well, yes, industry now with the laws and everything, yes, you do. It's like, so now can you sign here and just give me this information? Then you can see the house. And that's, oh, okay. And they sign it. It's the way you present it. It's just, and then right now it's just a policy and the way of doing business. That's the way we do it.
Yep.
So.
And that's why reading that last paragraph is so important because it explains it so simply. And then you can have your conversation and don't assume that they can't pay it. Like you don't have to go immediately into, and don't worry, I'll negotiate it I'll negotiate it for you. And if you know that you need to, then go right into that. But we need to add some things to our qualifying conversations about this. Rosie, were you going to say something?
I was actually
Oh.
gonna say something just to kind of along the lines what you were saying earlier, and what I feel has worked for me is just being like completely candid about like a comment you said, like it costs money to buy and sell a home, like period. And I feel like a lot of times they're approached with like, oh, don't worry about that. We're not going to charge you for this, and I got you in this and just whatever you have. And I feel like that's not accurate. So my approach is always like candidly saying like, hey, you know what, like this is a service and there are fees, like escrow companies need to get paid, title companies need to get paid, even the messenger that's going to run your deed to the county recorder, like it should not be a surprise when you get these numbers. You should be very well prepared by your agent to know that it's going to cost more than just your down payment. So I feel like that has been very it's been helpful for me, because then I don't have a client that's like, oh my God, nobody told me about this.
Yeah, we absolutely need, and really that was part of the deal with the lawsuit is the lack of transparency. And so really this is just forcing us all to be transparent. It's forcing us all to have the professional conversations we should have always had from the get-go. No matter how much we coached all of you to use a buyer rep agreement, maybe 10% did prior to it becoming, guess what, guys? Here's an update. January 1, it now becomes California law. It's official. The morning I was at the CAR conference, the news came through. As of January 1, it is the law in California that all licensees, regardless whether you have the realtor designation, which probably 99.9% do, must use a buyer representation agreement with the compensation on the agreement. And it cannot, so here's a change that's going to happen on the form in December, I'm certain. The law states that it cannot exceed 90 days. Our current form says 3 months, so they're going to have to revise that. We knew revisions were coming. That's a minute detail. It's not a big deal. It's not going to change how we use the form.
But they are going to go to the days instead of just,
It is, the law will change it to 90 days.
yeah, 3 months is too vague.
So, yeah. So, there's already been a change to the form to the BRBC that I don't think anybody ever even noticed. I didn't till they pointed it out. And they asked us if they wanted us to remove it because for some people it's causing ambiguity. I'm not even going to point it out because you won't notice it. And it might be gone tomorrow, who knows? But it literally doesn't change how we use the form or anything about it. So, okay, so what?
Jodi, you know, the box, there's a box on there that says that the buyer's not able to pay compensation. They can stick that, and then you continue till you have the conversation and ask them, well, do you want me to only show you properties that are not offering cooperative compensation?
Okay, but that's correct, but not the way you said it, right? Because not do you want me to, it's so I can still work for you and we can only see, right? We can only look at properties where the seller has indicated they're willing to pay my fee.
Got it.
Does that sound fair? Right?
Okay.
Because we can't give them the option because we can't work for free, right? Our brokers won't allow it. We shouldn't allow that, right? Christina?
Going off that point, what if, like, because I've came across seller or listing agents that when you ask, like, hey, are you offering buyer's broker compensation? They say just submit it with the offer. So in that case where the buyer can't afford to pay you, so you're only showing them properties that for sure will pay, do you just not show those properties? That's where the listing agent says.
If they're saying submit it with the offer, that means they're willing to consider it. So you would show them those properties. It's only properties that say no. I'm not going to. Yeah.
And I have a question. So, like, is that just a buyer's choice? Like, they're going to check that box? Or is there certain requirements that they have to?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Is there certain requirements that they have to fill to make, like, to be a buyer that cannot pay compensation? I guess that's my question.
So there is a form you can have them fill out. You can make them show you proof either way that they can or they can't afford it. I don't think, and Gov Hutchinson agrees with, Gov Hutchinson said this, I agree with it. I don't think it's necessary that we get that detailed, especially up front about that. If they say they can't pay it, don't want to pay it, whatever, check the box and just let them know you will not show them any properties where the seller has said they won't compensate.
So it's basically going to be limiting what they have access to buy.
Right. But in which case, make sure that you have a higher amount of compensation on your BRBCs. Here's the thing. Even if your buyer, say your buyer in Riverside County, Christina, only wants to pay 2% and the buyer's agreed to pay it. Okay. If the seller won't pay it, put a higher percentage on there because if they are willing to pay it, you can't get it if it's not on the agreement. So if you only have 2% on your agreement and a seller's willing to pay 2.5 or 3, you can't get it. So do not shortchange your buyer representation agreements. Put a higher amount on there. And if the seller or if the buyer's like, oh, I'm not paying 3% or whatever percent you put on there, right? Okay, I understand that. And we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. However, if we are able to negotiate this and I don't have it on here, I can't be paid that. Right?
So if we put like 3% and let's say the seller's willing to give 2%, and so your buyer technically would be like responsible for the other 1%, but they are not willing or they can't afford it, you can just get paid the 2% and that would be okay. But you can't negotiate like if you gotcha.
Correct. You never in a negotiation want to modify an agreement up. Never. That looks bad. That could be a fair housing issue. That's just not what should be done.
So just start high.
Yes, start high. You can modify it lower. So And remember, if you have a BRBC that let's say for sake of argument, has 3% on it, and a particular seller is willing to pay 2% or 2.25%, remember, don't shortchange yourself. We don't have to go down by full 0.5% increments, right? So whatever it is, do the modification for that address only, not for the entirety of the agreement. Because otherwise you're going to have modifications going up and down, left and right, if you have to do multiple offers because of offers not being accepted.
Jody, can you fill out a separate, like you gotta say you got a BRBC accepted and then there's one property. Can you do just a PSRI or RA for that one property on top of that?
If you have a BRBC in place, I would modify the BRBC.
Okay. So you're modifying for each specific property on that.
Yeah. Ask your broker about the other question, because the BRBC is gonna encompass everything, so it's gonna override probably the PSRA. Would be how I think they would look at that. You could verify that with your broker.
Because
But
I
that's
mean,
how-
because I mean, if you had the separate one, you just filled it out, you could put that in with the PS or with the purchase agreement and.
Yeah, but you already have a BRBC in place, so the modification would be after the fact, right? So after the negotiations.
Yeah. Okay.
Because really, guys, you don't need to modify it unless you actually go to open the escrow. If you agree to all the terms, then you modify it to match the terms you've agreed to. You
Good
don't
point.
have to modify it while you're negotiating.
Good point.
Okay. So just a one-time thing. The only way you'd have to modify it back up is if that escrow fell out of escrow and then now you're going again. So I still think you should modify it for the address only, for that purpose, but really you don't have to modify it until you're ready to open escrow. So it's all negotiated. Any other questions, thoughts, comments about all of this? Remember, like we talked about, we touched on it earlier, we talked about it. There are so many people in a transaction that get paid. There are so many different entities that have fees. None of those other ones reduce their fees to help your client. You as an agent do more work for your client than any one of those other entities. So stop discounting yourself. Get paid what you're worth. Does
In
that
that
mean-
case, 10%. Just kidding.
I love it. Does that mean you can't make an exception for somebody that is really in need and so it doesn't blow up the deal? Of course not. But don't just go there out of the gate.
Right.
And too many agents are going there out of the gate. We as coaches are reviewing too many BRBCs with 2% out of the gate. That is not good. That is not should not be happening. What that tells us is you need more conversation practice. So practice those conversations. Make sure you're at Mega Monday. Call another agent, meet with another agent in your office. The PC rosters in the PC toolkit. Call somebody and practice these conversations. Just because we don't have it in the calendar every day where we formally meet doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing this. Your conversation practice should be done daily. And if you're not doing it daily, you're not doing your job right. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, comments about compensation? Don't be shy.
So let me tell you what happened so I'm at an open house and the woman's contemplating using me as an agent. And she said that she was talking to another agent, et cetera, et cetera. So it was, in the process of trying to get a client. So I had the PSRA in front of me, and I said, it's got the address in there. And I said, well, what about just for this one property? You're interested in it, correct? And she goes, yes. And I go, well, then, for me to be able to talk to you about it some more and help you in acquiring it, then I need to have a written contract. So I got it out and I said, I have it right here. So then she says, okay, I'm willing to pay you 2%. Because I'm not worried about the buyer or anything. I'm going to pay you. The buyer doesn't have to, or the seller doesn't have to, I mean. So we built the PSRI down in 2% on the thing. And I said I normally charge 3. She goes, yeah, but I'm only willing to pay anybody 2%. And then I knew what the other side was going to pay anyway, so I went with it. But it's so now, but now I'm learning a little bit more about saying, well, you know what? I normally charge 3% and you want to pay 2%, but if the seller's willing to pay 3%, I need to have that on the paper there so we can get paid that, or so I can get paid that from them. So now I would have said better, put 3%, and if we get accepted into the contract and everything, then you and I can discuss that and change accordingly.
Yeah,
So a little
absolutely.
bit more with that. But that was the whole way that I got in there and just okay, I'm like gonna represent you, and okay, that's fine, 2%.
Let
It's
me
so
ask
it's
you
like,
something, Ernie. How do you know
yeah.
the other side was only willing to pay 2%?
Well, because I knew the agent. And I knew that that the discussions prior to in training or in the offices and stuff like that, says that he was representing the majority of people were going to land on 2%. So
But see, here's the thing. Don't forget, be really careful with these conversations about sellers, you guys.
yeah,
Really careful.
yeah. And then
CAR does
I didn't
not
say
want
any
us.
part of that. That didn't come out at all. That was all going on up in here,
Okay,
hindsight.
but here's the thing. The fact that there's a conversation happening in your office saying that the seller's likely to going to pay 2%, the bottom line is CAR does not want us having those conversations. That
Mhm.
is why there's no place on the listing agreement, there's no form, there's nowhere for us to put that in writing. And the reason is because it's dependent on the offer. If
Yeah,
an offer comes in that's going to net them way more than they thought they were going to be, they'll pay 3%. Why wouldn't they to take that good offer or two
yeah,
and a half or whatever, right? So be really, really careful when it comes to your own sellers, okay, that you are not telling agents my seller is willing to pay X% because
yeah.
your
So
sellers,
it wasn't that conversation about that specific thing. It was in a general training or discussion session to where he says, well, with the buyers that I'm working for, most of them, if they're willing to pay, they're going to pay 2%, in that conversation. And I logged that and knew who I was dealing with. So I figured, okay, here, I'll at least know I'm there. So, but I
and
hear what you're saying for sure. You can't do that, just flat
yeah,
out.
absolutely. And here's the thing, guys, this is, please pay attention to when your coaches are telling you things. And I know that all of you here are because you guys are all here all the time. But please help your fellow agents when you hear them talking about, oh, buyers are only going to be paying 2%, because we're hearing this a lot, right?
Mm.
It's the conversations that are being had. It's the limited beliefs and the limited thinking that the agents have. It's not that buyers won't pay more than 2%. It's that agents are afraid to ask them to. Agents don't know how to have these conversations. And guess which agents are going to be the absolute worst offenders, you guys?
Yeah.
It's going to be the agents that have been in this business for a lot of years. That it's going to be the agent. Well, I've been doing this for 20 years. This is never going to work. Blah, 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 blah. Don't listen to that chatter. Okay? These are agents that don't get coached, whether they're in Keller Williams or not, right? Now, your Keller Williams agents are going to have a better chance of having the right conversations, but there are Keller Williams agents that don't get coaching, whether it's this coaching, whether it's MAPS coaching, whatever coaching. So they get stuck too. We all get stuck in limiting beliefs sometimes. There's a lot of it out there, and it's contagious. You guys be the vaccines for these limiting beliefs. Talk to your fellow agents. Let them know it's all about the conversations we have. We absolutely cannot assume that a buyer is only willing to pay 2%. Have you had a conversation with every single buyer out there asking them that? Every buyer is different. We need to have that qualifying conversation with every single one and figure out where they're at. Please, you guys, help your fellow agents. Because the
Help the
agents that have been
industry, man.
doing this for a while are going to be the worst offenders. And here's what I'm concerned about. Those of you that are newer, you're going to want to listen to that because they've been around a while, so they must know what they're talking about. And I'm here to tell you, don't listen to that. And I'm not saying they don't know a lot of what they're talking about. And I'm not saying they're not smart and they're not good agents. Okay. I'm saying these are agents that are getting stuck in their head because they don't do well with change. Don't listen.
Was Christina that said, are you down in Inland Empire?
Hmm?
I'm Carlsbad.
Carlsbad. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I do a lot of like Temecula and Murrieta.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we got agents out of our office that are working out there, and that's what they were saying for it. But the agent here in the office is taking the listing presentation or listing contracts, and getting six. I mean, before all of this, but still working 6%. And getting it. So that it's not particularly a standard just because somebody said that. It's
No, and I'm still always going to
Yeah.
ask for at least 2.5%. I'm never going to start at 2%.
We'll start at 3.
I'm going to start at 10. Just kidding. Like, you know what? I'll go from 10 to 3. How does that sound?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's still those guys that are working that 7%, 7%, because I'm gonna bring freaking somebody to the table offering 4.
My broker before everything changed, my broker, he's also broker of record in Central Coast, and in he's at Porter Ranch too. He would offer 7-8% all the time. When people wanted him to reduce his commission or commissions are negotiable, I'll be happy to do it for 7%, right? And they laughed until he explained why. He got many a listing agreement signed at 7%, but he personally never kept more than 3.
Right.
The rest was given to the buying side to bring more buyers.
Yeah, and everybody was waiting to bring a buyer to his open house, or for that whole idea. I want somebody to buy his house that he's listing. For sure.
All right, guys, good discussion today. Thank you for the questions and the input. Let's go out there and get agreement signed. Don't sell yourself short. We'll have as many of these conversations as we need to. If you need more help with these conversations, pop into and ask a coach, right? Let us know ahead of time. We try to put the weekly workshops out a month in advance so we have what we're going to talk about, because we do invite agents in the market center to come that are not in the coaching program. So we want them to be able to put that out there. But Mastermind is a week at a time. And I'm noticing attendance at Mastermind has fallen off a lot. And I'm curious as to why. So if we're not talking about the things you want to be talking about, you need to let us know what you want to talk about, because this is for you. It's not about what we think we should be talking about. It's about what you need. Okay?
When do you hold your mastermind?
They're Thursdays at noon.
Is it a different link? Yes, obviously, or same one?
different link and it's in the calendar, PC calendar.
Okay.
Yeah. Because these are for you guys. So please let us know. And that's what we'll talk about. Okay. All right, guys. Well, unless you have anything else, I'm going to give you 4 minutes back. Go send a couple of texts to some people and get some more business.